Amanda North. I'm a board member with Matrix, which is probably why I was asked to be the moderator for this panel of people who are all new to me, but I've been very pleased to have a chance to get to know just a little bit. So just to make sure that you're in the right place, because we opted for no slides. Yeah. Does anyone know the name of this session? It's probably in the app, right? That's it, supporting patients and caregivers in their use of technology. So if that's where you wanted to be, you're in the right place. Oh, he's taken off. Bummer. Just for the housekeeping sorts of things that we have going on, like all the sessions, this one has an online component as well as the in-person component. I am your moderator. We also have an online moderator who will keep track of the chat and help with anything that might come up there. So we'll be checking in with Colleen as we go to see if she has anything to add. We set up our speakers today in a roundtable format, hoping that they will build stories off of each other and be able to interact a little bit with me as the moderator, just lobbing in questions now and then to try to keep them on track. That's what we talked about, right? Yeah. See, they're so nice. They're smiling. The Matrix tradition is to not read bios, so you don't have to listen to me read 4 bios for the next half hour. We will let each of our speakers introduce themselves in turn, and then I'll chuck in my first question. So I'll let you start, Julie, and go around the table with introductions, and maybe I'll go close the doors.
Great. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're so excited to be here today. I am Julie Brisky, and I am from the University of Virginia, UVA Health in Charlottesville, Virginia. And in that role, I am a business development lead and have a background as a critical care and Navy nurse.
Hi, I'm Anna Ditkoff-Dorsey. I'm a licensed clinical social worker at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm also the program manager for our telehealth department.
I am Tony Davis. I am with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services. And I am the Accessibility Resources Program Manager there at the administrative offices.
So I'm Kathy Schwarting. I am with Palmedicare Connections, which is a nonprofit in South Carolina. We serve as a telehealth network or / resource across our state. We also head up our state's broadband consortium, and we head some digital equity activities around teaching folks how to do telehealth.
So you can hear that we have a nice diverse panel who all come at accessibility and challenges for patients using telehealth in a lot of different ways. So the first question that I wanted to give to the group is sort of broad, just to let you understand where they're all coming from. So my question is, what are the challenges that your work reveals that's special to your target population or geography? What do we in the room as telehealth experts not know that you can tell us? That's sort of where we're going with this. And we have decided Tony's going first.
Okay, not a problem. Let me know if I need to speak up, because I am deaf, and so I'm not able to hear myself very well. So just raise your hand and say, speak up. First of all, I just wanted to point out there is 16% to 20% of people in the general population that have hearing loss, that are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind. In North Carolina, we know it's 16.2%. So that's a lot of people. That means probably 1 out of 5 people in this room has hearing loss. And so each of those people struggle with telehealth in one way or another when they use it. It's not an easy system to use for somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing or deaf-blind. Many providers, do I need to? Okay, I need to draw it closer, not a problem. Okay, many providers, they don't know how to serve deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind using telehealth. And many of those with hearing loss don't know how to appropriately use telehealth as well. So there's that learning gap on both sides. We often see that providers will tell people who are deaf or hard of hearing or deafblind to come into the office rather than use telehealth. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. An example that I had 2 weeks ago, for instance, was I went to a healthcare appointment, done with that, went out to the front desk and I said, for my next appointment, can I have telehealth? And they said, yes, we can set that up. We do that half the time. And I said, great. And then they said, oh, no, you're deaf. I said, what? They said, no, you're deaf. You need to come in. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you need an interpreter here at the office, or you need an interpreter through video in the office. And I said, no, I can do it through telehealth. An interpreter will be on the screen. And they said, no, we don't ever do that. And I said, well, that's what we're going to do. And so I gave them the access line phone number for their facility, or it was a big health system, and they said, okay. And I said, call them and find out how to do it. And I just walked out and I said, I'll see you on telehealth. And sure enough, it went great. But again, front office staff, providers, they don't know it's available for people with hearing loss, or they assume that it's not. We know people who are deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind don't use telehealth often. For instance, deaf and deafblind, only 30% of those populations that we surveyed in our state use telehealth. 30%, that's really low. We also know that accommodations are not often provided. So 78% of deaf patients wanted ASL. This is people we surveyed. And only 26% of them had an interpreter for that appointment. So 78% wanted it, only 26% actually had an interpreter for the appointment. Of those who wanted captioning on the telehealth platform, 28% wanted it. These are deaf patients. Only 5% received it. 43% of those who are deaf-blind said they had a poor experience with telehealth or below average experience. And as you know, most people have a pretty good experience. So for deaf-blind to not have a good experience, that's not good. Hard of hearing people who took this survey reported that there's poor audio quality often, and that was one of the biggest setbacks for them. So they had a really hard time being able to get good audio quality, and it's really an easy fix. So we see that really the biggest barrier is that providers don't know that it can be used for deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind. The patients don't know it's available to them, and that there's a lack of training for providers and patients. So what happens to patients who are deafblind, deaf and hard of hearing is that when they don't have an appointment like they want via telehealth, and they advocate for doing it, they become exhausted. And oftentimes that leads to people not even going to an appointment or not seeking health care. So that impacts overall health. It also leads to hypervigilance, and many professionals mistake that for harassment, or they mistake that for something's wrong with that patient, when really it's just, I want an appointment and I want accommodations. And then it also leads to distrust of the healthcare system. So their negative experiences with telehealth can actually lead to a distrust of the healthcare system in general.
That's a lot. Thank you. I found that to be incredibly eye-opening. And so maybe, Julie, yours will be a little lighter?
Sure. Absolutely. So coming from University of Virginia Health System and a large academic medical center, our target population, we're widening the nets quite a bit. The entirety of the Commonwealth is our target population. So whether that is the Eastern Shore, Southwest Virginia, or everything in between, even small communities and rural communities just outside of Charlottesville, we're hoping each of those people in the community could be an ideal candidate for telemedicine. So with that in mind, we have to be aware that there are various, across the spectrum, digital literacy, health literacy, access to technology. We have students, we have the entire breadth and scope of people we need to keep in mind and helping them access technology, and we know that there is not a one-size-fits-all. So what we're looking to do is really find the right size fits most with all of our education and all of our assistive ways that we can both market and encourage providers. I'm sure to those of you in larger systems, this is not new, right? But we have to realize that we have only so many resources to do this. Our current volume is about 8,000 video visits a month. That's across primary care, endocrinology, pulmonology, developmental peds. And we know that not all of those people in those populations are not looking for the same materials to be able to access those visits, whether they're video or audio. And so what we have realized is that there are two major touch points that we wanted to focus on in getting those patients both, one, prepared and scheduled for the visit, right? So we have to understand who is going to be, and we get this question a lot, both from providers who are trying to expand their business. Understand who makes a great video visit candidate, right? So who's going to be a successful, what type of disease state or age, what kinds of conditions lend themselves to good video visits. And then the second piece of the touch point is that just-in-time connecting to the visit on that day. And if we could spread our wings and really have that opportunity to drop in and navigate those pain points for patients, it would be much easier. But unfortunately, we don't have that. So what we have to do is try and make the education materials image-friendly, right? We have to replicate the experience so that people, and really it's about managing the patient's expectations for what would a normal experience be. Thankfully, not the entirety of the patients are high touch. They don't need that expertise and understanding who along the way needs their hand held for every moment. But identifying who those more vulnerable populations are, that's where we make the most impact. So part of the understanding for our video visits also is getting to the end of the completion. In analyzing our data, we have recognized that our video visits have a little bit of a higher percentage of no-shows than our in-person visits. So we're digging a little deeper to understand why that is. Are they not being reminded on time? Are the appointments inefficient? Because you're not going to the hospital, did you find something way better to do that day and you just completely forgot, so you're not connecting to the video? And then lastly, we don't really want to make assumptions about who doesn't make a good video visit candidate. And with that, I will say that in the last 6 months, we have had 5 patients over the age of 100 successfully complete their video visits. So we figure if we can get the information either to those patients and their caregivers or their support team, we want to emulate that and make it the lowest common denominator for everybody to experience that.
Okay, maybe Julie wins over 100. That's awesome. That's great. And developing education tools that make sense, really, for just about everybody. And I like how you said about it's not the one size fits all, but one size fits most, because you can come and sweep up the edges if you need to. I think Anna's next.
All right. I'm so surprised about your no-show rate. We actually, our telehealth no-show rate is much better than our in-person. So I'm very I'm surprised. So Kennedy Krieger is a pediatric hospital. So we mostly we see predominantly children, and we are a specialty facility. So we see children from right around us to much further flung. People come sometimes from other countries to come see us. So we did have a small telehealth program before the pandemic happened, which helped us really stand up our whole telehealth department very quickly once the pandemic happened. We were I think in 3 weeks, we had almost all of our visits through telehealth. But we did find, in doing that and making that fast pivot, we did find some issues. First, one is, does everyone have the access that they need? So even in Baltimore City, people think of digital access as a rural issue, but even in Baltimore City, we were finding a huge problem with people who have access to the internet, but not enough to do the telehealth, to have one kid in virtual school and one kid on an appointment and one kid playing a video game. It just wasn't sufficient. We also had a lot of situations where families were doing everything on mom's smartphone. So they didn't have the devices they needed. We work with a lot of families that have multiple special needs children. They might have multiple appointments. So we got a grant from the FCC to give out iPads and hotspots to families. And we had the providers recommend families. And we were very happy with that program. We were able to give these devices. We had to really assure people that they could use them and it was okay if they broke, if they got stolen. I mean, that was the first barrier we had, is we had families saying that they were putting them on top of the refrigerator because they were just so afraid, that if something happened to them, they would be in trouble. And we were like, nope, it's yours, have a good time. But we did find that when we looked at the numbers for this program, 55% of the devices went to families in Baltimore City. We also found that we were targeting a lot more Spanish-speaking families than like Kennedy Krieger as a whole. 3% of patients seen at Kennedy Krieger report Spanish as their preferred language, but it was 17%, and this program was for people who preferred Spanish as their language. And so we had to make sure the devices were in Spanish, we had to make sure the instructions were in Spanish, and we also found out things like consenting could be very difficult. DocuSign, we all use DocuSign, but the button to turn DocuSign from English to Spanish is tiny, and it's at the bottom of the screen. And so even if I send that document in Spanish, the family still has to be able to press that button to get all the DocuSign buttons into Spanish. Uploading an ID or their insurance card could end up just having families quit. Like they just wouldn't end up getting services because they couldn't do it. So we made videos in Spanish that we could then send out, just quick videos that walk through the process, and also being aware that people are joining from different methods. So, when we are looking at something for telehealth, can I connect to it from a phone? Can I connect to it from an Android phone as opposed to an iPhone? Can I connect to it through a Chromebook, which is what every kid in Baltimore City and Baltimore County are given for their schools? And usually the answer to the Chromebook one is no. And a tablet and an old computer. And so we really have to think about our families are just connecting in all different ways, and how can we make this accessible to them?
Thank you, Anna. That's terrific. That leaves us to Kathy to bring it home with challenges, and then I promise we'll start getting to solutions eventually. It's not all bad news.
So I'm from a very rural area in South Carolina. Is this working? Can you hear me? I was taking my taxi here from the airport, and I said, oh, how large is Norfolk? He said, very small, maybe 200,000 people. I said, really? He said, well, where are you from? I said, oh, a little tiny town in South Carolina. And he said, well, how many people? I said, maybe about 2,200 people. He said, oh my gosh, did you get lost at the airport? I said, no, we do. We still know how to navigate. I mean, we do okay when we get to the airport. But so I've lived in rural my entire life. I grew up in a town of 700 people. So when I moved to Bamberg and they had a Hardee's, I thought I had arrived, right? I mean, I had been in college in a large town, but so rural has a lot of the same barriers, but a lot of different barriers. And in our area, it's not just about whether they can afford to subscribe to a service. It's whether or not the fiber is running down that dirt road, right? So I grew up on a dirt road. My dad still lives on a dirt road. And there ain't no fiber going down that dirt road. You know what I mean? So the best that you can do is cellular service, which is really good a lot of times, but not so good a lot of times. And where I live in Bamberg, so I work on my phone a lot like a lot of you, but our cellular service has gotten so bad that there are only particular spots in my house where my phone will work, right? And I can't walk and talk on my phone at the same time. And listen, I have a direct line to Verizon, and they haven't gotten it any better. I mean, I have to just stand there and talk, and if I move, I lose connection. So we have a lot of connectivity issues in rural areas, and telehealth I am very passionate about telehealth. I spent about 15 years doing physician recruitment, and in rural areas it is very difficult to recruit, especially when your hospital files for bankruptcy and closes. So telehealth sometimes is one of the only ways that we can bring services into our communities for the people who can't get out, right? Maybe they don't have transportation. I had our director of DAODAS, which is our alcohol and drug abuse centers, about 3 years ago. She said, Kathy, we've got a pot of money. You know, I know y'all are having issues. We'd like to pay for Uber drivers. I said, have you ever been to Bamberg? I mean, have you ever been to Lakeview? We don't have Uber drivers. We don't have taxis. Some of these people don't have means of transportation. The only means that they have for us is through maybe our Council on Aging, and you have to schedule that 3 days out, right? And that doesn't always work if you get sick overnight, or you have, you know, just like COVID, all of a sudden overnight you become ill. So access issues are really big for us. And telehealth is a great solution for us when we can make it work. So we put out a lot of telehealth carts in churches, in housing projects, in independent pharmacies, anywhere where we feel like people are congregating, and we're trying to bring care to them, right? So that is a barrier: access, geography. If you have 5 houses that live in this little area, there's not a big enough return on the investment for the ISP to expand service to that area. So what do? They either have to have a lot of money and buy a lot of tools to go on their roof, or they suffer. So, and I would like to say that I appreciate what Tony talked about, because I have lost over 20% hearing in both of my ears. I just put my hearing aids in because I don't hear very well either. And trying to service that segment of our population is difficult. And a lot of times it's easy just to say, well, we have a digital literacy class, but, you know, if she's blind, we can't accommodate that. But to take that next step and to figure out what that solution is, that's why we're all together, right? How do we service the lady that's blind? Or how do we service the gentleman that is 75% deaf in both ears? And there are, and I think this is where we're going, I get caught up in, you know, Tony totally changed my thought process when I was speaking, but there are a lot of barriers, and there are a lot of resources, but people do not know about these resources. So we have a broadband office in South Carolina, and if you have a documented hearing loss, you can not only get a free iPad, but free service on that iPad indefinitely. So, and they want us to promote that, and I say, well, how do you tell people? Oh, we tell people like you. Okay, really? So even when we do have resources, and a lot of times we have resources in our communities, people don't know about them. And when COVID hit and the schools went virtual, and we were trying to make sure that our kids all had devices in our community, because I will tell you, 50% of our seniors were flunking high school mid-COVID, not because they weren't smart enough, but they didn't have support in the home. Their parents didn't know what virtual learning meant. Their grandparents, who a lot of times are the caregivers, they didn't know what that meant. Their kid could tell them anything they wanted, and they believed them because they didn't know any different, right? So we don't get the information about resources out. And when we talk to the schools to try to get the information out that we had resources available, she said, oh, well, we'll email them. I said, are you listening to yourself? I mean, and this is our superintendent. And I said, the issue is they don't have the daggum internet. Come on, people. They don't have email addresses, right? And you want to email them, really? How many people do you want to connect with, right? So we're doing that in South Carolina now. We're doing a Connect SC, because every state is getting money for digital literacy, right? And you know what they want to do? They want to send out an email to people. Come on. You're not reaching the people that really need the service. If you were doing that, go to the grocery store, go to the laundromat, right? Go to your local office on aging, but that's hard, right? It's not easy. It's easy to send out one email in a listserv of 30,000 people, right? But that's not what we should be doing. So there are lots of barriers. There are lots of resources. We just have to make sure that the people who need them understand them. And I know I got way off target, but
Oh, no, you're doing great. You're doing great. Thank you. Okay, so now you've got a whole bunch of challenges. I hope you're dismal and depressed and you think this could never be solved. That's what we were going for. And before we get to solutions, there's another question in here first. I wanted to challenge everybody to tell us about the data that you're collecting behind these problems that you've just told us about, right? So what kind of information have you gathered to inform your work? Because it's one thing to say, here's the problem, but you won't know you've made any progress on a solution without the data. And I'm asking it that way because I know everybody has a different answer, and I think it's interesting. So do you want to go in the same order? You want to mix it up? Oh, yeah, great. I think Tony's next. Tony, tell us about gathering data related to your challenges.
Thank you. So what we did was we set up a work group where we recruited as a division statewide members of a community who mostly worked for our division across the state, who were deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind themselves, and subject matter experts. And we came together at the table and decided we wanted to do a survey of all of those in North Carolina who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind. And we put together the survey. It included ASL videos by a signing deaf person that explained the survey to anybody who was using sign language. And we collected this great amount of information. We recognized also that this wasn't a big enough survey. I mean, quite a few individuals participated, but we need to get a bigger sample. And I was actually talking to someone from Johns Hopkins just an hour ago and said, hey, is there any way we could partner and figure out a way to get more data on this subject? But we started with these populations. And then we also had some interviews with people, just asking them all about their telehealth experiences and what they've gone through. And we found that not only was there data collected, the yes, no's, the did I have access or did I not have access, but people had so many stories to share about barriers, which really helped us to understand what was happening with our communities in North Carolina. So really that's how we did it. And then I'll talk more about our solutions later, but that's what I'll say about the data. Yeah.
Thank you. That's perfect. Let's go ahead.
Sure.
Same order is nice. It helps us develop a pattern.
We like patterns.
I like patterns.
So we were using and evaluating both qualitative and quantitative data and understanding the process and the pain points. And so in our qualitative experience, we went to the clinics themselves because there are so many specialties and primary care. Each one is going to provide valuable feedback that's unique to those populations. People at the beginning that I was amazed really valued our video visits over the pandemic, including speech-language pathology, and learning a lot about specific audio settings and how our vendor Zoom has these very specific tricks and tips you can do. So we learned a lot from speech. We have some instances in the kidney transplant world where we have patients who are getting evaluated for transplant possibilities, and those are some high stakes visits. There's required by law education videos that need to be watched, and opposed to say like a 15-minute follow-up visits, these are patients who are seeing panels of 3-4 specialty providers in a row, and so those are high stakes if the video doesn't work on the first try. So we set up a bit of a pilot where we do some of the higher touch outreach with those patients in advance, just to A, confirm that they are involved and set for those visits, and then B, that they have the devices and know what to expect, and a real-time number to troubleshoot. So the clinics gave us a lot of feedback, and then taking data from our surrounding communities, we did some journey mapping of patients in the local southern Albemarle community and outside of Charlottesville. And we created 3 personas. Then we walked through what it would be like to get to an ED visit, an outpatient visit, or even just to get ambulance transport in those regions. And that taught us a lot. And then our qualitative data that keeps us honest, we have our Press Ganey surveys after each of our visits. And so understanding, directly from the patients shortly after that experience, how are we working? What is their take on their likely to recommend from our experience? And then with that data, we can go back and forth and better refine some of our experiences and talk to those providers. So I think I'll stop there in terms of our gathering data. We have a lot of high hopes about setting up patient focus groups and really getting some more feedback on the user experience. I'm sure we're all experiencing what it's like to try vendors and equipment and understand what works, what's compatible, what's not, and really do a better job of understanding how we can make that the true patient-centered experience.
So with our telehealth technology access program, the TTAP program, we leveraged a lot of our Epic data. So we use Epic as our EHR. We had information, because these are our patients, about those patients. But we also collected information from the providers who were requesting. And we noticed some things, like, for example, a provider might say that a family needs something in Spanish, even though Epic doesn't say that. And even using that provider data, once we sent out a survey afterward to see how people felt about the program, there was still, I think it was in the 90% that we got right as far as language goes, or it was a little bit less than that. But that still meant there were people who were not getting their device and their directions in the right language. So we were able to find some issues by looking at that data. We also found out that through the survey that we sent out, the Qualtrics survey, asking people if it helped, if they thought it was beneficial, a large percentage of people said that it actually made telehealth possible to have the devices and to have the connectivity. It was 83% said it made it possible. And 84% said that the iPads improved the quality, 72% said the hotspots improved the quality. But we also found out that the people who struggled weren't necessarily reaching out to us. So I think that's something that we're thinking about going forward, is if we see someone's not using this information, because we can, sometimes we can see if they've accessed the data or not, maybe we need to reach out to them, because the same people who are having trouble with the device might be the people who don't feel comfortable asking us. Because we do have one of the wonderful things we have is a hotline that people can, well, not a hotline, but a helpline that people can call to talk to someone and talk through the process. But it doesn't help if people don't access it.
So we collect data in a couple different ways. So PCC is a nonprofit, but we are part of a group called the South Carolina Telehealth Alliance, which is a statewide telehealth effort that our legislature has put a lot of funding into to expand telehealth. So we collect data from mainly our large health systems, which we typically have 4 in the state, as well as most of our FQHCs and a lot of our rural health clinics. But I want to say in 2021, we had maybe a little over 1 million telehealth visits conducted across the state. And what we do is we work primarily, we have a very good working relationship with just about every rural provider in the state. And for example, I know that Care South, which is one of my FQHCs during COVID, when they started doing a lot of telehealth, about 50% of their patients, for whatever reason, could not conduct a telehealth visit, right? They either were technically challenged, they didn't have a device, they didn't have the internet. So those numbers get reported to us so we could come up with a solution, which we'll talk about, I think, in the next question. But I had a rural health clinic in my community of Bamberg, and probably 25% of her patients couldn't access telehealth. So when COVID hit, prior to COVID, our organization was really focused on teaching providers and getting healthcare providers interested and acclimated to doing telehealth. That all changed when COVID hit because they all jumped on board. All of a sudden, you didn't have to teach them anything, right? They figured it out. They didn't worry about protocols and policies and how it was going to integrate into existing. It was amazing. It's like overnight, everybody could do it, and nobody had to get any education on it. But the patient still needed the education. So our focus completely changed with our nonprofit when COVID hit, and it became much more patient-specific. Now we're navigating the whole telehealth reimbursement because in South Carolina, we're one of only 7 states that doesn't have telehealth parity. So that has a lot of restrictions on the telehealth that we can provide, and that is a challenge with your private payers and your legislation, and I never wanted to know anything about advocacy work, but if you work in rural America, you have to understand what advocacy is all about, because what we try to do is get the patients. We try to get the patients to do videos, to testify, to educate our leaders. Yeah, hold on one second, I'm sorry, the pollen is killing me. So anyway, to educate the providers about what telehealth has done for them. And we have individuals, I will tell you one brief story, and I think data is great quantitatively, but when you can tell a story with the data, that is another way to look at it. And we had a lady, and we'll get into this at the next question, that went through our digital literacy program. She had had a heart transplant. She was like 74 years old. Other than that, very healthy. She had to drive 2 hours one way to our teaching hospital where she received her heart transplant. And once you go to an academic medical center, it's amazing, but then all of your providers are there, right? So she had diabetes. She started seeing an endocrinologist. She was driving 4 hours a day to go to the physician's office. When we gave her a device and the training and she could do telehealth, she started doing all of her visits via telehealth. It completely changed the quality of her life. And that's a true story. We did a video about it. I took it to our legislature and I said, listen, if you ever doubted the power of telehealth, listen to this lady. Don't listen to me, right? Don't listen to the doctor who is arguing about reimbursement. Listen to the lady where it's impacted her life and see how much different it is. Now her kids don't have to take off work an entire day to take her back and forth to the doctor's office because she can't drive, right? So those are the stories to me that the data is great, and you got to have data for everything that we do. But read between the lines, I think, a little bit with the data and find those stories that just the statistics don't tell, right? So the data is twofold for us.
That's terrific. And you summed up nicely what everybody said about data plus stories. And they're all illuminated better by the stories. So now I know the moment you've all been waiting for. Please, panel, tell us about some of the solutions that you have come up with, that you've implemented, or that you're working on implementing when you get there, or when you figure out how. And Tony, it's back to you again.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on something Kathy just talked about. And you talked about that person who is now able to save so many hours a day, not having to drive, being able to meet via telehealth. Think about all those deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind patients that were told, sorry, come into the office. You can't meet via telehealth because we only provide the accommodation in the office or so forth. Think about what that meant during COVID. That was a higher risk of exposure to them. And also think about what it means now. Many deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind are underemployed. Just getting to an office that's an hour or two away is going to be challenging for them on many levels. I just wanted to put that out there. So a solution. So this is what happened as a result of that work group with 25 subject matter experts, many of who were deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind, all working together for the last 2 years. Today, I'm excited about this, we just released our telehealth webpage, as a result of that work group, thank you, I have business cards with the address for the website on the back, so please take it. So on this website is a curriculum for deaf patients. It's a curriculum for hard of hearing patients. These are separate. And there's a curriculum for deaf-blind patients. There's a curricula, or I should say guidance, for healthcare providers on working with deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind. There is a, what else do we have? A curriculum for ASL interpreters. And then we also have self-advocacy letters or accommodation request letters. So basically it's a letter that somebody can go into this template, and it's already pre-typed for them. They just put in their name, what type of accommodations they want, and a place where they can, the healthcare provider can contact and get more information on those accommodations. So oftentimes we see that people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind have a struggle with self-advocating. And so we made that easier by creating a letter that they just type into. It'll be their own letter, though. So this is going to be a big thing, I think, for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind patients. Now, it's not focused on the digital inequity. It's focused more on the health equity, the communication equity, which I think is a big piece of telehealth. Now, we're definitely going to add more about the digital equity on there as we get more information, as we build more partners as a result of this. So we look forward to that. But we're really excited about this. Now, what we need is your advocacy, or you taking this forward for us. So please get my business card and look at the site and then share it with all you know. Because it's not only a North Carolina thing. Yeah, we developed it in North Carolina, but I believe it's only one of its kind in the whole nation. So please spread the word if you can, because I really want to see deaf, hard of hearing, deaf-blind patients be able to use telehealth no matter where they live. California, Minnesota, North Carolina, Virginia.
Awesome. Congratulations, Tony. That's so exciting.
Thank you.
Well, we certainly don't have something as definitive as curriculum, so you've set the bar very high. Thank you. We could all aim to be so targeted with that. So thank you for setting an emulative bar. In our program, we were fortunate to stand up a dedicated IT help desk for patients when we launched the video visits go live in October of 2021. So this is a help desk line that is dedicated for telemedicine visits and MyChart navigation. It's available 24/7, 365. And these IT analysts, they give us a great wealth of data that allows us to understand the breakdown by type of where they're assisting folks. And so once we get past the nearly 50% of the calls are to do a MyChart password reset, we could then go back to some of our Epic analysts and say, hey, how can we finesse the steps? What are some of the bare bones requirements we can do? Can we take away the Social Security requirement that you have to do? Can we finesse our educations to have patients understand they can self-serve and do some of that themselves? Then you take the next 30% or so of those calls and we see that they're directly related to MyChart and Zoom. So then we say, okay, we have to figure out how to make the process better, the education materials better, and then even with the help desk, give them guidelines so they can do the real-time troubleshooting with the patients and say, okay, if you look at your images, we're on step 2A. Do you see what I see? Okay, great. Here's what you need to do. Or just the reassurance. And that's been extremely helpful. We have meetings with them once a month, and we can better refine the data that we're pulling from them and understand the trends so that we can do a better job of targeting our instructions and materials. Another solution that we've experienced is this past October, we implemented the guest workflow for Epic. So Many institutions choose to have the requirement of having MyChart in order to do video visits, and we elected to not do that as an access and equity issue in case there are problems or cell phones or app downloads or all of the reasons that people are speculative about what's going to happen. And so the guest workflow is a push that gives a link to folks who are non-MyChart account holders, and we've seen some higher increases in participation, and we've seen a doubling of participation in a pre-visit update. We were hovering around 40% doing the e-check-in ahead of time, and now in the last 2 months we're cresting 80%. So that's been some real-time feedback about, we think, the people who are successfully getting through. And then with that, we've also seen an increase in the volume of our help desk calls. They've gone up almost by 1,000, from like roughly 3,000 to 4,000. So those are some of the solutions that we've been able to do. And then again, if we are able to replicate our secret sauce is the personal touch with the clinics. Back to the example of the transplant team, they were so frustrated with the inability to have consistent video visits with their transplant candidates that they were going to almost give up and direct them to go to one of our partner sites, so to not do the visits from home because there was such a disconnect. So they went from, we're canceling telemedicine, to this year through March, we're at a 94% success rate of having those visits being completed. So it's a provider satisfier, a patient satisfier, and then efficient scheduling. So those are some of our solutions so far to date, and we can't wait to do more.
When I think about the difficulties that our families have, I kind of put them in 3 categories. And the first one might seem a little strange, but it's shame. I think that there is a lot of shame around not being able to use these digital devices. The other thing that I do besides being a clinical social worker is I'm also on the EPIC team at Kennedy Krieger. And so I get the people who really struggle with EPIC, and I meet with them and I help them, with this computer program. And even with them, these are people with advanced degrees. There's so much shame about not being able to use this technology. So I think we really have to think of ways to cut through that shame, to really empathize with these families, to have a human touch in these. So having a helpline is so important. And one of the things I'm really happy about with our helpline is we have Tina, and I know I can't make clones of Tina and give you all a Tina, but Tina is so wonderful on our helpline. She's warm. She really sort of helps the family feel comfortable as she's talking them through the process. Because you can have all the technical knowledge you want, if you can't communicate it and you can't create a situation where someone feels comfortable and safe enough to hear it, then you're not going to get anywhere. The other thing is the awareness piece, making sure people really know about it. And that can even be within your hospital, because, people still act shocked about this program sometimes, even though we send out, emails constantly and we've, gone to meetings to describe it. So really making sure you're constantly doing outreach even within your hospital to make sure they know we still got this, we've still got hotspots. We started doing something where we're putting some of our hotspots in clinic so that they can actually hand them to the families. So especially we're doing that in our neuropsychology because they do a lot of referrals. So they might do the in-person testing and then they can hand them a hotspot that they can take and use for their follow-up visits. Because it is really important, once again, to have that personal touch. We're also looking at contacting families proactively and asking them if this would be helpful to them. So we're not waiting for them to figure it out and find it out. We're trying to figure out ways to let them know. And then the other thing is the access piece. So, like I said, really testing to make sure anything you're using is working on as many different devices as possible in as many different scenarios. We can't figure out every single scenario, but if you try something and it doesn't work on an Android phone, then that's not something you want to use because there's going to be a huge population who can't do it. And creating our own materials to give to families because, once again, technical knowledge is great and it's important, but you need to be able to communicate it. Our hotspots came with the option to download a 300-page instructional manual. And we were like, nope. So we created a one-page, this is how you turn it on and use it, and we translate it into Spanish, and all our hotspots go out with that. So really making sure that you have the information in a way that people can use it. And it's been a real learning experience for me to think about the reading level and keeping the reading level, even in Spanish, keeping the reading level down to a certain point so that we know the families can access it. And then using texting. Now, texting is so hard because it's not HIPAA compliant, but there are things you can do, like we text out our DocuSign consents. And because it's in DocuSign, because they hit that link and go into DocuSign, it's secure. But we have a lot of families who would not be able to access telehealth if we were not texting out those links to DocuSign.
So, I think those are really great solutions. And I think I love your point about the shame, because that is a huge piece of it. Even that's a piece that telehealth overcomes. So if you notice when COVID hit, there were some surveys out there, and for folks that deal with alcohol and or substance abuse, there was a national survey conducted through, I think it was CMS, maybe NIH, and I'm not sure who the other one was, but because of the fact that they no longer had to go into an actual facility and people didn't have to see that their car was there or that they were walking in, using telehealth allowed them to cut the no-show rate, right? And they had less overdoses amongst this population during COVID, and a lot of that had to do with the shame piece, right? So when they were doing telehealth, nobody knew that they were an alcoholic, right? Nobody knew that they were a drug addict because they weren't at the actual facility. And getting our leaders and our legislatures to understand that, I think, is important, but you just prompted that with me. But so I'll tell you what our solution was. We started out doing telehealth 13 years ago. And in order to do telehealth, you have to have internet service, right? And in order to have internet, you have to have access to it, but you also have to be able to afford it, right? And then if you have it, you got to have a device to use with it. And then you got to know how to use your device. So it's very multifaceted for us. It's not just simple, you get somebody internet, because that's not always the answer to the problem. It's like throwing money at a problem, that's not always, it doesn't help the folks. So what we did is, and we had no idea what we were doing when we started this, but we had patients calling us and they'd say, Kathy, I know you do telehealth. I didn't really know what that meant till I saw the president talking about it on the news, right? And I have a telehealth appointment, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how I get into it. I don't know where I go. I don't know what I'm supposed to use because my doctor's office just called and said, I've lined up a telehealth appointment for you. So we were like, well, gosh, we need to start teaching people what that means. So we started our first project with our Department on Aging. And if you'll remember during COVID, our aging seniors were severely isolated. Even me, I didn't want to go around my dad because I was afraid I'd get him sick, or I didn't want my kids around him who had been going out to parties in college, all that kind of stuff. We all went through that. And their depression rates rose, right? Their chronic illness rose because they weren't going to the doctor. They were afraid to go. Their kids had scared them to death a lot of times. It's like in my case. So we started out teaching seniors, and we did our first digital literacy class, I think, back in June of 2021, and we had maybe 25 seniors in our first class. We taught our first 100 seniors, and what we did is we gave all of them a device. We gave all of them a cellular-enabled device for a year. We taught them how to use it. We taught them how to do telehealth on that device. We taught them how to use Zoom, right? Churches were using Zoom at the time. So that for their whole, it's not just physical, but their whole mental health, right? Be able to connect with your kids and your grandkids. And We gave them homework. We're doing 3 days at this point, 3, I think, 2.5-hour days, and we've modified since then. But we made them bring in their child's phone number, or their grandkid's phone number. We teach them how to send out a Zoom invite, accept one, and we'd make everybody do one, right? Make them comfortable with it. We taught them how to use Google. We taught them how to go online and look up diabetes, look up your medication, read about it, understand your own health care. Don't just be dependent on somebody to tell you what you need to be doing, but understand maybe why you're having an upset stomach. Maybe you're not taking your medicine at the right time of the day, or you're not taking it with food or water. So how to use Google. We taught them how to use Google Classroom because, again, remember, a lot of our students were failing, and we wanted these caretakers, who were a lot of times grandparents, to know what Google Classroom looked like, right? We taught them a little bit about cybersecurity because that's another thing that happened during COVID. Cyber attacks went way up, and all of our vulnerable seniors and our vulnerable individuals were being attacked. And so we did all of that, and we learned an awful lot. We learned, I will tell you, those were the most appreciative. I've been in healthcare for 30 years, and those were the most appreciative folks I have ever worked with in my entire 30-year career. They learned something that they never thought that they would learn. And my daddy, who is 76, and he's a widower, and he lives 2.5 hours away from all of his children, swore he would never, ever get on the internet. Well, guess what? I got him in a class. He called me, and he said, "Kathy, I unhooked my MiFi." Isn't that what it's called? And I said, "Yeah, Daddy." I unhooked my MiFi, and I hooked it up all by myself. I gave him a little booklet, and he said, I know how to check the weather now. Did you know you could check the weather online? I said, yes. So anyway, it was amazing to teach these folks. And we have since then trained about 1,200 people. They've all either been seniors or they've been low income, because to us, those are the most needy, right? We have provided all 1,200 with a device. There are a lot of big corporations out there that you should contact. Lenovo donated 1,000 brand new laptops to our digital literacy program.
Wow.
Right? These are fabulous devices. And teaching people that just because you drop it, it's okay. It's still probably going to work, right? A lot of people are just afraid, like you talked about. And you have to teach them to get over that fear, but to open up their world and to teach them what it looks like to see your physician. Because a lot of people, if I remember my statistics correctly, about 76% of people are weary of that first telehealth visit because they're afraid it's not going to be confidential. People are going to hear, people are going to see. And once they do that, about 78% have been convinced that it's okay and it's a good visit, and they're extremely satisfied, right? So getting them over that first hurdle, but teaching them digital literacy, making sure they have internet. We have since then hired a digital navigator. There are a lot of subsidies out there for a lot of people who can't afford it. And we call them, we help them make sure they get internet at home. We help them apply for the subsidies, which is another thing. Sorry, I told you I would talk. Anyway.
I need to stop you there because we only have like 1 or 2 minutes left in the session. So thank you. I appreciate it. Everything sounds wonderful. I hope you all are uplifted and encouraged that there are solutions as promised in the session. We have a minute for questions. I will bring around a microphone if you want to formulate your question, but I want to prioritize the one that was entered from the Zoom room, right? The concurrent session online. The question is to Tony. Does your team provide live virtual presentations to educate healthcare providers on the importance of providing mindful care, support, and access for patients who may be deaf or blind?
Thank you. I'm aware I'm losing my sight too. I know I am. So yes, absolutely. I'm willing to give presentations. And our division is as well. So we have several different offices around the state, and if they're in North Carolina, we can send somebody out. But if it's a national thing, I can do that as well, and bring in other team members. So absolutely.
Terrific, thank you. Do we have any questions in the room before we call it? I can bring the mic. Oh, look at that. Okay, so in that case, I'm gonna say it's 5:30. I would love to thank the panel if you would help me with some applause. Thank you so much, everybody. And don't forget to come get Tony's cards and read all about the resources that you can share with your patients and providers. Thank you, everyone.